All right, so this is our fifth session on mysticism and the Baha'i faith. And again, to briefly recap, we've been setting up a framework for understanding, um, roughly based on the seven valleys of Baha'u'llah and other mystical tablets, that we will find tends to map onto overall two ways of looking at perceiving the divine. The first, we can say it we can in a word summarize it as dualistic, and the second is non-dualistic. The first is the one that's immediately obvious to our senses, that the world that we perceive is divided into things, atoms. One of the most deepest and most profound and useful discoveries of modern science is that everything is made of atoms, and that assuming everything is made of these separate atoms gets you a long way in understanding the universe. And so it is both a scientifically valid approximation in a number of in many situations, but also it's the intuitively obvious thing to our senses that everything is divided up, and that intuition we have, that I'm different from you, and we're different from whatever ultimate meaning or ultimate cause of the universe is contrasted or complemented by a non-dualistic, you can say, intuition. It's not an obvious intuition about the universe that ultimately everything is one, that ultimately the separateness that we perceive, whether it's the separateness between atoms or the separateness between human souls, is ultimately a kind of an illusion, that that there's in the end no true distinction between the realities of the universe, and that includes the reality of the human soul, realities of multiple human souls, and our relationship to the divine. And so you have these two kind of modes of being and seeing, which traditionally are in tension with each other. And the journey of the seven valleys and the mystical journey that Baha'u'llah charts in the seven valleys can be seen as a journey through various stages in which a dualistic perspective is foregrounded, followed by other stages, mystical stages, in which a non-dualistic perception of reality is in the foreground. And just to add to this, we had talked in previous sessions about how Baha'u'llah talks about these two great mysteries. We'll never understand these two great mysteries: the mystery of the human soul and the mystery of God. And Baha'u'llah says, to paraphrase, that our recognition and confession of helplessness in the face of these two great mysteries marks the acme of human spiritual attainment. It's kind of this high watermark of our understanding of things, is when we realize that we really don't understand. And I would argue in connection with this discussion of the mystic journey, that these two great mysteries, the mystery of God, the mystery of that divine light residing within us, of the soul, are actually not separate mysteries, but they're actually facets of the single mystery, the mystery of consciousness itself, of which the human soul can be seen as one mode of, and which God can be seen as the originator and underlying consciousness underneath and behind all things. So from the perspective, the non-dualistic perspective, these two great mysteries resolve into a single mystery. So in the last session, though, we started to try to look at the spiritual path in a little bit more detail, not just in terms of two stages, but in terms of these various stages that Baha'u'llah describes in his mystical tablets, preeminently in the seven valleys, but as we will see in a number of other tablets as well. And trying to provisionally present a kind of skeleton key to this, the valleys of search, love, knowledge, of unity, contentment, wonderment, and true poverty and absolute nothingness, which are the traditional 7 valleys of Baha'u'llah, are can be divided into valleys of distinction, or through which one sees through the eye of distinction, and through this perspective of dualism, which includes search, love, and knowledge, followed by valleys of unity, contentment, wonderment, and beyond. And so it's the and beyond part that we're going to start looking at more in this session. We looked at search, love, knowledge up to unity in the last session. And there we found that one way to think of the progression through these mystical stages is to think of it in terms of how one resolves opposites, how one resolves, the opposing forces and realities that we see in the world, love and hate, and this thing and that thing, I and thou, and so forth. And one way of talking about, as we'll see in a profound mystical tablet of Baha'u'llah that recently published, that also talks about it in terms of in these similar terms. One can think of it as progressing through stages, a series of stages in which one first becomes aware of the existence of these opposites, and then following that, in where one is suffering the tension of those opposites. That's the valley of love, in which the lover is yearning after the beloved. It never really attains reunion with the beloved, but is always in pain because of this longing, because ultimately the soul is perceived, as we see, incorrectly or inaccurately, as being something other than the object of its desire. That is followed by the valley of knowledge, in which the opposites are reconciled, in which one sees the end in the beginning, in which one sees the first and the last, and so forth. But that still, as we'll see, is one of the valleys of limitation. There are still further modes of consciousness that open up beyond the reconciliation of opposites, which could be summarized as seeing the unity of opposites, and then in which the end and the beginning are one. This is the valley of unity. And then beyond that is the annihilation of opposites, and then transcending the entire framework of opposition, the entire framework of valleys, stages, and so forth. And that's what we're going to dive into today. Baha'u'llah tells us, however, he kind of warns us at the beginning, once you get into the valley of unity and beyond, you can't really describe what you're doing in the same way. I mean, you can still use words, as Baha'u'llah does, as all the mystics have, but Baha'u'llah warns us that you really can't describe what's going on in these valleys. He says the tongue faileth in describing these 3 valleys. Here he's talking about the valleys of contentment, wonderment, and true poverty and absolute nothingness. And speech falleth short. The pen steppeth not into this arena. The ink leaveth only a blot. In these stations, the nightingale of the heart hath other songs and secrets, which make the heart to leap and the soul to cry out. But this mystery of inner meaning may be whispered only from heart to heart, and confided only from breast to breast. So despite that, he still goes on and uses words as he must to describe these following valleys. And the valley following the valley of unity is the valley of contentment. His description of it in the 7 valleys is fairly brief, as the parallel description in Gems of the Divine Mysteries is also fairly brief. The one in the 7 valleys goes like this. He says, the wayfarer, after traversing the high plains of this supernal journey, entereth into the city of contentment. In this valley he feeleth the breeze of divine contentment blowing from the plain of the spirit. He burneth away the veils of want, and with inward and outward eye perceiveth within and without all things the day of God will satisfy everything out of his abundance. From sorrow he turneth to bliss, and from grief to joy, and from anguish and dejection to delight and rapture. Another way of translating the idea of contentment is independence. You might think, what does that have to do with the contentment? It's the idea is that independence, if you're wealthy enough not to have to worry about things in the world, then you have you have a kind of independence of the from the vicissitudes of the world, and that's what bestows this contentment upon you. So similarly, the value of contentment also is, this is why he refers to wealth and God satisfying everyone out of his abundance. It's a kind of being free, being above the fray, so to speak, because one has the spiritual food to sustain oneself. But this valley of contentment, which is, I suppose, perhaps one of the most briefly described by Baha'u'llah, gives way to the valley of wonderment. And here also, wonderment is only one possible description or translation of the term hayrat, which also could be translated as confusion or bewilderment. Although wonderment casts it in a bit more of a positive light. But as we'll see, as Baha'u'llah describes the Valley of Wonderment in Gems of Divine Mysteries, you catch a little bit more of the confusion part of it, the bewilderment part of this Valley of Wonderment. In the Seven Valleys, he says, after journeying through the plains of pure contentment, the traveler cometh to the Valley of Wonderment and is tossed upon the oceans of grandeur, and at every moment his wonder increaseth. Now he seeth the embodiment of wealth as poverty itself, and the essence of independence as sheer impotence. Now he is struck dumb with the beauty of the All-Glorious. Again is he wearied out with his own life. How many a mystic tree hath this whirlwind of bewilderment snatched by the roots, and how many a soul hath it worn out and exhausted. For in this valley the traveler is flung into confusion, albeit in the eyes of him who hath attained, such signs are esteemed and well beloved. At every moment he beholdeth a wondrous world and a new creation, and goeth from astonishment to astonishment, and is lost in awe before the new handiwork of him who is the sovereign Lord of all. So we do catch a bit of this sort of, it's confusing, it's bewildering. Baha'u'llah describes the same valley of wonderment in Gems of Divine Mysteries in the following way. He says, O thou who art mentioned in these tablets, know thou that he who embarketh upon this journey will marvel at the signs of the power of God and the wondrous evidences of his handiwork. Bewilderment will seize him from every side, even as hath been attested by that essence of immortality from the concourse on high. Increase my wonder and amazement at thee, O God. And then he quotes a bit of poetry. I knew not what amazement was until I made thy love my cause. Oh, how amazing would it be if I were not amazed by thee. In this valley, the wayfarers stray and perish ere they attain their final abode. So there's this idea of perishing, of not in the sense of the valley to come, but maybe in the sense of anticipating the valley to come. That the soul, having reached the valley of unity, is, at first very contented with this station. Okay, I get it now. I see the end in the beginning. It's all one. This is, a very, it's a very life-affirming and independence-bringing realization that one can escape from the great titanic struggles of this lower world, and understand that beneath all of these contradictions is this unifying agency. But this contentment at achieving that station gives way to confusion or bewilderment at realizing what the true implications of it are. And the true implications, if you follow the thread to the end, is what the mystics call fana, which has been translated as true. Well, a larger phrase in the Seven Valleys has been that includes the word fana has been translated as true poverty and absolute nothingness. Fana is often translated as nothingness or self-surrender, pure evanescence. It's the station of the soul that the ego that vanishes, whose ego boundaries fall away and dissolve entirely. And that thing that we think of as the self, the lower self, ultimately, the nafs, to use the term, ancient term actually, it's in the Bible, in the Old Testament as well. which originally it's the breath. It's almost like it's almost as though our ultimate reality is a breath of the creator. But that self is ephemeral, and realizing its ephemerality, um, it leads to entrance into this city of true poverty and absolute nothingness, which in the seven valleys gives the impression that this is the final valley. But what Baha'u'llah does in the seven valleys is he actually takes the idea of fana, or absolute nothingness, and kind of joins it with the valley afterwards, baqa, or immortality, which the Sufis always understood that there were these two stations at the end of the mystic journey. This station of in which one loses oneself, and then in the end one finds oneself again. So it goes from self-annihilation to a stage beyond, which is regaining immortality in a way. But when one regains immortality, it is on different terms than one had than one understood before. The self that is enjoying immortality is a different self than the one that was perceived in the earlier stages. So this is how Baha'u'llah describes this stage of fana. He says, after scaling the high summits of wonderment, the wayfarer cometh to the valley of true poverty and absolute nothingness. This station is that of dying to the self and living in God, of being poor in self and rich in the desired one. Poverty, as here referreth to, signifieth being poor in that which pertaineth to the world of creation, and rich in what belongeth to the realms of God. For when the true lover and devoted friend reacheth the presence of the beloved, the radiant beauty of the loved one and the fire of the lover's heart will kindle a blaze and burn away all veils and wrappings. Yea, all that he hath, from marrow to skin, will be set aflame, so that nothing will remain save the friend. Thou hast given up the drop of life and drawn nigh unto the ocean of the well-beloved. So that's Baha'u'llah's beginning of the description of this valley in the seven valleys. And as before, we can find a parallel description of the same valley in Gems of Divine Mysteries, which is in so many ways a parallel text to the seven valleys, and really ought to be read together in conjunction with the seven valleys, and indeed with the Kitab-i-Iqan, because Gems of Divine Mysteries knits and welds themes together that are found in both the seven valleys and in the Book of Certitude. So this is the description of this valley in Gems of Divine Mysteries. And should the servant ascend to even loftier heights, quit this mortal world of dust and seek to ascend unto the celestial abode, he will then pass from this city into the city of absolute nothingness, that is, of dying to self and living in God. So here too, he joins this sort of what might be thought of or seen as two separate stages of the dying to self is the fana, and the living in God is baqa. So you have both of them being described in the same sentence. In this station, this most exalted habitation, this journey of utter self-effacement, the wayfarer forgetteth his soul, spirit, body, and very being, immerseth himself in the sea of nothingness, and liveth on earth as one unworthy of mention. Nor will one find any sign of his existence, for he hath vanished from the realm of the visible, and attained unto the heights of self-abnegation. How can a true lover continue to exist when once the effulgent glories of the beloved are revealed? How can the shadow endure when once the sun hath shone forth? And Baha'u'llah, to go back to the Baha'u'llah's description of the seven valleys, he talks about giving up the drop of life and drawing nigh into the ocean of the well-beloved. That's something that Abdu'l-Baha says as well in one of his tablets, describing this this station of self-annihilation. He says, release yourselves from this world's life, and at every stage long ye for non-existence. For when the ray returneth to the sun, it is wiped out, and when the drop cometh to the sea, it vanisheth. And when the true lover findeth his beloved, he yieldeth up his soul. So all of this might raise in our minds a question, a confusion, a bewilderment. What happened to this idea of personal immortality? And Are we losing the idea of personal immortality in this? We have this idea. We started the spiritual journey with a particular idea of the soul, which maybe in the end ended up being the nafs, ended up being the lower self. But we started with this idea of the soul with its ego boundaries, containing our thoughts, our memories, our experiences, our virtues and vices and everything, as being this kind of bubble, but not a bubble, because a bubble is something ephemeral. You can pop a bubble and then whatever is inside becomes outside. But we think of it as enclosed in this impermeable sphere that nothing gets in or out of it. It's an atomic reality, kind of bouncing around in the divine realms. And death is simply a translation of that bubble identity, from being attached to the body to being a kind of a free-floating thing. And now it still exists in the same way as before. Memories are still there, everything about us is still there, but now we're just no longer attached to the body, and now we just have a different kind of existence. These descriptions of the spiritual path that end with annihilation perhaps makes one wonder maybe that isn't the final way to think about what's in store for us. Maybe what's in store for us is actually infinitely better. But how can you get infinitely better? To get to that, and this is where I think it gets really interesting. We come to Baha'u'llah's description of mystical stages beyond that of annihilation. And this is where, if all we had was the seven valleys, we might think, perhaps incorrectly, that that's kind of, the end point is this station of annihilation. But both in Gems of Divine Mysteries and in other mystical works that were published along with the seven valleys and the four valleys in this recent volume called Call of the Divine Beloved, we find descriptions that go beyond that seventh valley. I'm, for lack of, for having to type some characters on the screen, I said Valley 8+. But Baha'u'llah is clear that once you go beyond a certain stage, to even think of things as existing in stages is now part of the problem, not part of the solution. So numbering the valleys beyond this is probably a fool's errand. But at least as regards Gems of Divine Mysteries, where Baha'u'llah discusses stages beyond, he seems to describe at least two, one being the immortality that follows the Valley of Annihilation, and this immortality is of course immortality in God. It's perpetual existence in God, and what that means we'll have to discuss. And then the valley beyond that, Baha'u'llah says, is the valley that has no name or mention. It's like, so here's the sort of stage beyond stages, and it's referred to in Gems of Divine Mysteries, and as we'll see in some of the passages that we're going to look at now, Baha'u'llah seems to be referring again to that stage beyond stages in various of his tablets. The first, we might say, is in the Seven Valleys itself, which seems to foreshadow this sort of further elaboration of the mystical path. And this comes in in the 30th paragraph of the Seven Valleys. And it's such a lovely orienting paragraph, because in a few sentences, he kind of orients you to a whole bunch of valleys. It stacks them on top of each other and gives you a sense of what characterizes each. He's going to do that in another tablet, which we'll look at in a few minutes. So here he says, such is the state of the wayfarers in this valley. And here he's talking about the Valley of Love. And it's in the context, I believe, the story of the watchman. In the Valley of Love, you're pursued by the watchman, you're agonized over it. It's a cause of great pain and suffering because you don't see the end in the beginning. But Baha'u'llah says the people of the valleys above this, and now he's talking about the Valley of Knowledge, see the end and the beginning as one. So there's a resolution of the conflict, but it's still within the realm of limitation, because the end and the beginning, you see the end and the beginning, but you haven't yet sort of reached the stage of the unity of them. But Baha'u'llah says, nay, they, and now he's talking about the residents of the Valley of Unity, see neither beginning nor end, and witness neither first nor last. So they're not even in the sort of, that's not how they look at things anymore, as ends and the beginnings. But then he goes one step further, and this is where I think he's foreshadowing this realm beyond attributes. He says, nay, rather the denizens of the city of immortality, and this is the word baqa, so this is the realm beyond fana, who dwell in the celestial garden, see not even neither first nor last. They fly from all that is first and repulse all that is last. For these have passed over the worlds of names, and swift as lightning fled beyond the worlds of attributes. Thus it is said, the perfection of belief in divine unity is to deny him any attributes. So this, I think, absolutely foreshadows the conceptualization of mystical path as something which is really not about stages. It's really not about going from point A to point B to point C and then through to the end. It's ultimately, in the final analysis, about letting go of all of these stages. So let's see how Baha'u'llah deals with this same progression in his tablet to the lion-hearted soul. So this is one of these newly translated mystical works in Call of the Divine Beloved. It's towards the end of Call of the Divine Beloved, and it goes into a fair bit of detail, and I think it's worth going into in detail, because you may not have read this. If you had read the Seven Valleys when you were younger, if you had encountered it before, you might not have encountered this and had a chance to read this yet. But in light of our efforts to look at the Seven Valleys and understand the sort of logic behind each of the valleys, I think we may be in a better position to understand what Baha'u'llah is doing in these paragraphs in this tablet to the lion-hearted soul. So he's referring to these differences that people perceive at the beginning of the journey. As to perceived differences, these can be attributed to the diverse stations that have been attained by them that tread the path of search and mystic knowledge. Thus, at one time, the wayfarer beholdeth the lover hastening in search of the beloved through the wilderness of desolation. And at another, he seeth the beloved yearning for the lover across the wilds of longing and devotion, or wandering aimless and bewildered the wastes of love in his pursuit. Oh, for a drop to drink, the thirsty soul doth groan. Oh, for a thirsty soul, the spring in turn doth moan. So he's here describing what we've seen before, is this stage of the lover and the beloved not yet realizing that they're one, and so there's this stage of wandering and pursuit and so forth. Now he goes to the next stage. He says, from yet another vantage, he perceiveth that the lover and the beloved are one and the same, and that the seeker is himself the very object of his search. How can the lover from the loved one ever part? So it is that at times the lovers of the celestial beauty sound the clarion of, say, all things are of God, while at others they raise the call of, it is from thyself. And elsewhere we know Baha'u'llah quotes one of the Islamic hadiths saying, he who hath known himself hath known his Lord. And it's a common refrain of the mystics that knowledge of oneself ultimately translates into knowledge of God. Turn thy sight unto thyself, that thou mayest find me standing within thee, mighty, powerful, and self-subsisting. So this is the station of what we might say the station of knowledge, perhaps, that the valley after the valley of love. But we go to the next stage. And here's where it starts to get interesting, where Baha'u'llah gets into some more nuance. He says, some have related the aforementioned stages to the inner and outer journeys of the soul, which is the station of the knowledge of certitude, while others that have quaffed the wine of reunion regard each and every stage as relating to that knowledge, and consider the two stations of the eye of certitude and the truth of certitude as being exalted above and sanctified beyond these realms and all that pertaineth unto them, even as hath been clearly affirmed by that mystic knower. And the mystic knower he's referring to here is the one who originates this idea of these three stages of certitude, of the knowledge of certitude, the eye of certitude, and the truth of certitude. So there's a whole background behind dividing the mystic quest into those three stages, which has been compared to the knowledge of flame, understanding how fire works, studying it in physics class or something, understanding it's a kind of chemical reaction. The eye of certitude, seeing flame, and the truth of certitude is being burned by the flame. So it's often compared to, and we can intuitively understand the difference in how well you truly understand something if you've heard about it versus seen it versus really directly experienced it. But Baha'u'llah doesn't go into that. He doesn't sort of take that idea further. Instead, he says, for in all these stages, and he's referring now to the first, at least the first three valleys, he says, the mirror of the wayfarer's heart may bear the reflection of shadowy desires, wayward thoughts, and worldly attachments. Wherefore hath it been said that in these stations, at one time the hosts of reason are triumphant, and at another the armies of love prevail. At one time the clouds of affliction and sorrow conceal the heavens of gladness and joy. At another the eternal leviathan of love devoureth in one fleeting moment all manifestations of sadness, anguish, grief, and dejection. And the morn of divine guidance dawneth forth with the joyful tidings of despair not of God's mercy, and the gentle breezes of his providence dispel every vestige of torpor and estrangement. These tidings, however, are not constant and immutable in these stations of search, love, and knowledge. And the wayfarer remaineth confined between the right hand of faith and assurance and the left hand of denial and despair. That last part, I think, is really the kicker here. Baha'u'llah is describing how it is that the first three valleys are still valleys of limitation. They're valleys of limitation because there's still one is still confined, and it's ultimately a confinement of our way of thinking to divide the world into faith versus denial, this versus that, the true versus the false. It's when one reaches the stage beyond, one understands the things that one might have considered to be even unworthy of God. One sees the divine even in those things. The things that one might have even shunned as being godless, one understands there's God inside that as well. It's a transcending beyond this realm in which you divide the world into believers and non-believers. Baha'u'llah is telling us here, this is a valley of limitation, valid in its own degree, as all of these valleys are, but still beset by its own limitations and something which can and should be transcended. So Baha'u'llah transcends it then, or discusses what's going on in the next station. And this is in paragraph 9 of this tablet to the lion-hearted soul. And here Baha'u'llah says, some wayfarers remain forever veiled in these stages. Others are assisted by invisible aid from the source of unfailing grace, whereat the hosts of the realm on high raise the tabernacle of divine power, and the ascendancy of "and verily our host shall conquer" is manifested, obliterating the signs and standards of every worldly attachment and limitation, even as alluded to by some who have attained this station. At such times, the ascendancy of God's names and attributes will so surround a soul as to leave it no place either to stay or to flee. This station, however, hath its own obscurities and impediments, for they that journey towards the land of divine unity and detachment are still wrapped within the confines of names and attributes, and take delight in their gardens and bowers. Thus it is that in describing these stations, some have made reference to the unity of existence and the unity of appearance, wahdat-e wujud, wahdat-e shuhud. By this is meant that the seeker will close his eyes to all save his beloved and open them to naught but his beauty. He will pass beyond the mortal world and approach the everlasting realm. He will see no beauty but the beloved's and hear no utterance but his praise. That is, he will avert his gaze from aught save his beauty and refuse to hearken to any melody but the sweet accents of his voice. Sounds like an exalted spiritual position. Howbeit, Baha'u'llah says, some are led astray even in this station, for no sooner do they inhale the fragrance of reunion and hearken unto the voice of the doves of heavenly grace then they imagine themselves to have attained perfection and wander lost in the wilderness of self-conceit, thus depriving themselves of the soft flowing stream of divine providence and the ethereal cup of heavenly delight. So even when you get past the valleys of search, knowledge, love, into the valley of unity, Baha'u'llah is saying this is even a valley of limitation, this valley of unity. So what's beyond that? You have to get beyond names and attributes themselves. Here's the sort of the final stage. Yet others, assisted by the grace of the everlasting friend, consume these veils with the fire of his love and step into the meads of ancient glory. That is, forsaking the wilderness of the unity of existence, they attain to the ultimate abode of the true appearance of the divine unity. So clearly will they witness in this stage God's all-encompassing mercy that in every created thing, both in the world and in the souls of men, they will behold him who hath been interpreted as the holy outpouring. This is talked about in the Kitab-i-Iqan. No longer will they close their eyes to any beauty nor stop their ears from hearkening to any voice. For there is no prohibition in this stage and no debarment, inasmuch as in all things they will discern with both their outer and inner eyes the revelation of the signs of him who is the king of all names and attributes. And in every atom they will find a door that leadeth to the garden of divine unity in the city of pure abstraction. Wherever I turn my gaze, 'tis thee whom I behold. So entirely will the hearts of the wayfarers be transported by longing for the ecstasies of this station, that they will come to conceive no stage apart from this stage, to see themselves as abiding within the court of the beloved and circling round his sanctuary, and to consider it as the ultimate abode of them that search and the uttermost station of such as have attained. Of course, note that Baha'u'llah here is trying to describe a station that is beyond all names and attributes. Of course, he has to fill it. He's loading it chock full of names and attributes because he has to use words. So it's the kind of it's the impossibility of trying to write about mystical subjects. At one point, his whole point is you can't describe this because you've transcended names and attributes. But he has to make it seem I guess as it truly is, as an attractive goal to try to strive for. So there's another tablet of Baha'u'llah, I think, which pulls these various ideas together, these ideas of there being kind of three stages, the stages of distinction, and then these stages of unity, and then something beyond that, which lets go of the first two. And it's in an authorized translation from a tablet of Baha'u'llah. And I have where it's published in the original here. You can find it online, I believe. He said, "Know thou that between us and the creatures there standeth a ladder with 3 steps. The first is described as the world and its vanities. The second as the hereafter and all that is ordained therein. And the third as the kingdom of names. Whoso is enabled to traverse these stations shall attain the presence of the Lord of names and attributes in less than a moment. Take heed, O people of Baha, yes, lest ye tarry at these stations, pass over them as swiftly as a passing cloud." The one that really gets me is that the hereafter and all that is ordained therein, our idea, this, which we know is an imagination. We know any idea of the afterlife is like a baby trying to understand the outside of the womb. It's not possible. But Baha'u'llah assures us that these imaginations of the hereafter and what is ordained therein is something we have to transcend. But beyond that, we also have to transcend just the kingdom of names itself. And I think this neatly parallels the idea of the mystic path reaching a point where even the concept of stages becomes something which is transcended. And this becomes even more clear, I think, in another one of these newly translated mystical tablets of Baha'u'llah. And it helps explain why are all these different languages for understanding the divine. Baha'u'llah here is now describing 3 different kinds of seekers. So he's not just describing, this is a little bit of a different framework than describing a seeker traversing 7 valleys. Now he's describing how 3 different kinds of seekers traverse, say, those 7 valleys. And the first kind is the one that actually traverses them valley by valley and gets to the end. So here's how he describes it. He says, it is clear that the wayfarers in the wilderness of search and longing, of attainment and reunion, have numerous degrees and countless stations. Some, after spiritual struggle and physical toil, ascend from the lower reaches of no God is there to the lofty bowers of but God. And this is a reference to the Shahada of the Muslims. La ilaha illallah wa Muhammadun Rasulullah. There is no God but God. So the la, there is no God, la ilaha, is the negation that that this confession of faith begins with. First of all, you have to negate all that is not before you affirm that which is. And so it is said that the letter of negation precedes the letter of affirmation. And so Baha'u'llah is referring to this here, that you start with negation, you get beyond that, and to get to the affirmation. So they ascend from the lower reaches of no God is there to the lofty bowers of but God. Flee from the shadow of negation to abide in the limitless realm of affirmation, and abandon the privation of a transient existence for the bountiful assemblage of reunion. This is the uttermost limit of the realm of effort and striving. So the most you can do by working at it day by day, ascending, sort of working your way through the valleys, so to speak. Baha'u'llah describes this as one mode of the spiritual search, but there are other modes of the spiritual search. In the second one, he says others, without receiving the least intimation of no God is there, pass beyond the highest horizon of but God, without even tasting a dewdrop of the degrees of self-surrender, that's fana, ascend unto the kingdom of life everlasting, that's baqa, and without partaking from the wellspring of utter abnegation, quaff the wine of the Ancient of Days. These souls, as they traverse the stages of wayfaring and ascend unto the stations of reunion, walk a different path and occupy a different rank. So there's a way to traverse the stages without going through without going through the station of fana. So that's a really interesting little fact. But then there's still a third station, a third kind of seeker. And now we get into the seeker that is no longer confined even by the notion of stages and valleys. He said, still others, without having perused a single letter of the kingdom of names, or acquired the faintest intimation from the realm of attributes, this is those who have gone past the third step of the ladder, which pertaineth to this world, dawn above the invisible horizon of eternity and return again thereunto. 100,000 seas of glory surge in their luminous hearts, and yet to outward seeming their lips are parched. A myriad rivers of holiness stream within their breasts, and yet no trace thereof is to be seen. The books of God's consummate wisdom are recorded upon the tablets of their hearts, and yet they breathe not a word thereof in the world of appearances. They dwell in the Egypt of certitude and journey in the lands of resignation. They are intoxicated with the beauty and entranced by the glory of him who is the all-glorious. Heart to heart they whisper hidden secrets. Soul to soul they unfold abstruse matters. The mysteries of the divine essence glow upon their brows, and the lights of divine unity shine from their peerless faces. They clothe themselves in the robe of concealment and cast their sleeves over both this world and the world to come. Without wings they soar, without feet they walk. Without hands they grasp and hold. They speak an unknown tongue and observe an unseen grammar, of which all the world's inhabitants know not a single letter, save those whom thy Lord hath willed. Unto each hath a share been vouchsafed in his book, and they shall all attain unto that which hath been destined for them. So this is from the tablet called From the Letter B to the Letter H, also in Call of the Divine Beloved. And so after describing these three different categories of seekers and how, one traverses the valleys, the other gets to skip a valley or two, the third, it's like, what valleys? He gets to describing, well, why is it that there are these different kinds of seekers? What does one do about that in the world? And this is where Baha'u'llah follows in the same tablet with such a truly amazing insight about the nature of the spiritual path and the fact that it is so diverse, and that the diversity of the spiritual path, the fact that there are different people at different stages, that some people are not even realizing they're on the path yet, that others are at various points. That some, skip stages, some are not even in the, speaking the language of stages. Baha'u'llah is able to embrace and affirm this whole universe of spiritual striving in the following terms. He says, since all do not possess the same degree of spiritual understanding, certain statements will inevitably be made, and there shall arise as a consequence as many differing opinions as there are human minds, and as many divergent beliefs as there are created things. This is certain and settled and can in no wise be averted. We read this actually a few sessions ago. Our aim is that thou shouldst urge all the believers to show forth kindness and mercy and to overlook certain shortcomings among them, that differences may be dispelled, true harmony be established, and the censure and reproach, the hatred and dissension seen among the peoples of former times may not arise anew. So this is where the mystical path makes connection, a firm point of contact with the social aims of the Baha'i faith in the world, the pragmatic aims of the Baha'i faith in the world, bringing people together, forging unity. How do you forge unity in the world? Baha'u'llah is not giving a path, not offering to us a path in which unity is attained by everyone in the end believing the same thing. He's giving us a path forward in which we recognize that differences of belief, even in very foundational things, which may to us seem very foundational, that these differences of belief are a feature of the human condition and will persist. And instead, he gives us pragmatic tools for how to get along in the world in spite of that difference, how to get along in the world in a way that actually transmutes those differences into something which is a common source of strength. And that's where we can directly segue at this point, if we wanted to, into the administrative order, into consultation, Baha'i principles of consultation. How do you forge unity in the world among people who simply believe different things, who simply have irreconcilable views about fundamental things? Are there ways to get people to sit in a room together and through good faith attempts to get at the reality of things, come up with decisions that can be agreed upon by all? This is a very pragmatic end, but we can see here how it's totally rooted in the mystical side of the Baha'i teachings. That so much of Baha'u'llah's mystical writings actually can be seen as his way of unlocking for us the very pragmatic and social goals that he sets forth in the later stages of his revelation, where at the earlier stages, say in Baghdad, he was more concerned with these mystical topics. So I'll end on that point for today. This is session 5. So we still have 2 more sessions, and we're going to go back, I think, a bit more away from this sort of theoretical level of what are the stages and what do they mean and how can we understand them in relation to the one and the many and all of that. And maybe go back to some of the beautiful passages about the experience of the divine and how that's been, how that has been described in various tablets. Although now we understand that experience of the divine can be from the perspective of different valleys, and so it can be quite, they can be quite different from each other. All right, so I'll pause there and open the floor to any questions or reactions.
Can I ask away?
Please.
Okay. So for someone who feels like they're in, Valley Zero, what are the cheat codes? Or, hearing about all these, ways that the wayfarer can travel, it's like, wow, that's a lot. What can we do? Is there any way to hop into one of those, better boats, or is it just like, well, you got stuck with you got to just grind it out deal? I mean, what is it? I'm curious. I have no idea.
Well, I don't know if I have a good answer, but just knowing that there are these different ways forward, knowing that there isn't a single right answer, knowing that all that everyone around us may be following a different kind of spiritual path, not necessarily the same stages, not necessarily the same sequence. Some people may forever be in the valley of whatever, in which they see differences between this and that. And just understanding that gives us a kind of acceptance that we might not have had before. I'm not suggesting that this can translate into like an acceptance of injustice or an acceptance of bigotry and so forth in the world. Oh, well, they're just in another valley and it's valid in its own. That's where the pragmatic goals of the faith, I think, prevent us from reaching that kind of quietist conclusion. But as far as cheat codes are concerned, clearly there does seem to be a sort of a cheat code, because Baha'u'llah is describing people who are able to kind of skip to the end, and he even says this in the Seven Valleys. I didn't quote that passage, but you may be familiar with it, where Baha'u'llah says it's possible to traverse all these valleys in one breath, and sort of in the twinkling of an eye. And so there's a cheat code. What is the cheat code? I suppose it would be, if there is anything, it's what Baha'u'llah lays out in part 2 of the Kitab-i-Iqan. He gives, this is the cheat code. But, oh my brother, should a true seeker determine to tread the path of search and the knowledge of the Ancient of Days, he must before all else cleanse and purify his heart, which is the seat of the revelation of the inner mysteries of God, from the obscuring dust of acquired knowledge and the illusions of the embodiment of satanic fancy. He goes on in this vein about how he has to purify his heart, but then he gives another. I enumerated them at one point in my copy of the Iqan. I sort of numbered them. It looked like there's 18 or 19 of these. It's like, so you pray every morning, and you don't backbite, and he gives it all. It's like, okay, this is the kind of these are the cheat codes, and it's not easy, but it's certainly not impossible what he's describing. It has to start with this like all-consuming desire to get there, and that's where most people are not even in that valley of search. Most people don't realize there's valleys to be traversed. They think this world is just all there is, maybe. But once you have that intimation that there's something there to be seen, and this world is maybe not what it appears to be, then at that point you're in the valley of search. And I guess I couldn't answer any better than that. What Baha'i sometimes call the Talmud of the True Seeker.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I don't know about anyone else, but I can't envision anyone but like Abdul Baha as that third type of seeker.
Yeah,
that just kind of
maybe those are just the prophets or something. Who knows? Yeah, maybe not. I mean, he says, those who attain this valley, he said, they whisper it, to each other, in confidence. It's almost a sort of, you wouldn't know, because people don't talk about it. At the same time, anyone who thinks they've attained it probably almost certainly hasn't. And Baha'u'llah issues that warning also in Gems of Divine Mysteries, where he says, if you've actually made it all the way to the end and get all kind of proud of yourself, you get sent back to the very first valley without realizing it. So there's always that warning. And there's another warning that Baha'u'llah gives in another one of his tablets that is not yet, for which there's not yet an authorized translation. And he gives a very dire warning to those. He says, spiritual seekers who have on the path of their journeys have come to certain understandings. He says they should only be conveyed to those who are ready for them. And he warns that if certain spiritual truths are delivered to those who aren't yet ready to hear them, he said he will have perpetrated 3 great crimes. He said betrayal, injustice, and murder. He says because he will have killed the faith of the person to whom he has revealed that thing which they weren't ready to hear. And he said, and in killing his faith, he's killed that person. I can't imagine stronger language in relation to the spiritual path, in relation to really much of anything. But the fact that he would say something like that is certainly a word of warning that, that there are pitfalls, that, and Baha'u'llah, for example, in the tablet of, in this description of this valley of wonderment, he says, this was in Genzarine Mysteries, he said that, they stray and perish ere they attain their goal. There's a kind, and this is an advanced valley, the valley of wonderment is like, you're 6 valleys in, and Baha'u'llah says, the seeker strays and perishes before they even attain their goal. So the spiritual quest, I guess, it's not without its dangers. And one of the dangers is the destruction of one's comfortable ways of thinking, which from one perspective is a good thing, but only if you're ready for those comfortable ways of thinking to be destroyed. And if you're not ready for them to be destroyed, it's not a good thing. But this, in a way, this is just maybe triple underlining what Paul said in the Gospels. You give milk to babes and meat to those who are stronger. And what Baha'u'llah said, how many things can be said? Well, how does it go? How many utterances can be regarded as timely? How many things a man knoweth that that can't be spoken? How many things that can be spoken cannot be regarded as timely? How many timely utterances cannot be regarded as suited to the capacity of the hearer? That's a rough paraphrase, but he ends on the same point. It's a true and timely utterance, he said, but it's not suited to the capacity of the hearer, so it can't be spoken. So that's in Gleanings, I think. So this idea of there being a kind of hidden danger to these ideas, the wrong ideas, delivered at the wrong moment are destructive. Anyway, we have 3 hands raised now. Who wants to jump in?
I believe I was next. All this talk, I don't know why it reminds me of like chutes and ladders. Like there are shortcuts, there are ways to get back to the beginning. That's where my head's at right now.
Yeah.
I have a question regarding your perspective on like how time falls into all of this. Like, I don't know if I got this idea from somewhere in the writings or if it just kind of like my own kind of conception, but I, had this idea that time is something that eventually we will, supersede. It's like a limit, similar to like the material plane. And, one day we will supersede it. And yet, like, progressing through these valleys implies that there is like, a before and after, like you're in this valley, then you're in this valley. Right. So I'm curious, like in your reading, what your perspective on like, where time kind of comes into it.
But before Einstein came along and ruined our sort of clean way of dividing the world and phenomena into space-like things and time-like things, we could have believed that there's time in the next world, because because even though it's immaterial and is not confined by materiality and space, you could still imagine time marching on, in the spiritual realm. But unfortunately, Einstein comes along in 1905. He publishes this paper showing the intimate connection between space and time. So that really threw a wrench in the works for people who wanted to try to forge a sort of theological space for time in the spiritual realm. Now that we understand that time and space are actually part of the same framework, mathematically described, then, if as we believe, the human soul exists essentially in a realm that is not confined by space. It also is not confined by time, almost by the definition of the space-time framework, which also I think immediately sort of casts doubt on our whole language of progress in the next world. Our whole idea that the next world is where the soul maybe completes the lessons it learned in this world, or maybe it progresses from one world to the next. And it kind of throws it throws in doubt the whole framework of our thinking about the next world, which as I was suggesting in the course of this presentation, Baha'u'llah seems to indicate that this is an idea we have to transcend anyway. What does it mean to say there's progress in the next world if there's no time? It's the whole idea just becomes incoherent. But Baha'u'llah is saying we have to transcend the whole idea of the afterlife anyway. How then does one understand the world? I mean, and this idea is something that the Greeks, there were like two really fundamental ideas that the ancient Greeks started thinking about. One is the one and the many, and the other is change and motion. And so these are among the original problems that philosophers tried to figure out. And the Baha'i faith, I think, has a stance on both of these. The first question is, in the end, is everything one, or is everything a bunch of separate things? And some Greek philosophers proposed the idea of atoms, like Democritus. Well, it's a bunch of atoms in the void, and everything's bouncing around, which ended up being really close to the post-Enlightenment scientific view, post-Newtonian view of the world, as separated into a bunch of different things. But from early times, philosophers also well, I probably can't name them because they all sort of merge in my head, but other philosophers said, no, it's all one in the end, and these appearances are illusory. As we know, the mystics in the realm of religion, mystics have also argued that in the end, oneness is the rule, and this idea of many is in the end an illusion. And I think the Baha'i writings would ultimately side on the oneness, on the oneness end. Although they would add the nuance that viewing things as many, viewing things as particles, this whole atomic view of the world, is useful and valid within a particular frame of reference. But if you really want to dig deeply and say, well, what is in the final analysis, what is what's the ultimate reality? Well, it is that everything is one. And likewise, with the second big question of, well, is change an illusion? And is everything really, or can reality be described as fundamentally changeless? And this is another kind of thing. Well, obviously things are changing. I mean, step into any river, and you never step into the same river twice, because the water's always rushing past, and we're all growing up and getting old and dying, and a new generation is being born. It obviously changes the rule of the day in the world. But even some of those early Greek philosophers suspected, well, maybe actually what we see and perceive as change is really an illusion. And maybe there's something eternal and unchanging that's more real, that's behind things. And that was really Plato's fundamental insight, I guess, was that ultimately, everything that we see is less real than the forms, the ideas, which are, everything we see is kind of like the shadows cast upon the wall of the cave, but the forms are the objects that are casting those shadows, and those objects are eternal, unchanging, just like geometrical figures. There's no evolution or motion or whatever in those. So there's been a debate throughout the centuries on this whole question of motion and change. What's the view of the Baha'i faith on that main question? I would, I guess, submit ultimately that the Baha'i teachings tend to lean in the direction of change, progressive revelation. There's a constant outpouring, continual outpouring of divine love, which is the motive force behind all things, through which consciousness arises on various planets that are able to recognize and love and know their creator, which kind of completes a kind of loop. But this is something which is constantly in motion. The universe is constantly evolving, constantly seeking, constantly waking up to the knowledge of its own essential divinity. And that's fundamentally a theology of motion, not a theology of stasis. And I think that fits with the Baha'i idea of contributing to an ever-advancing civilization. Civilization is not just something to be preserved as it was perfectly created, however many thousands of years ago. Civilization is something which is constantly in motion, just like the human soul, just like evolution, physical evolution on the planet, just like the cosmic evolution everywhere around us. and that's fundamentally a doctrine. I don't know, an idea of change being essential. And now I've lost track of what the original question was, but
I was just saying, like, yeah, how do you conceive of
oh, the afterlife? Yeah. So yeah, so is the afterlife. So if everything is ultimately one, and if ultimately everything is in motion, but but even the words change versus motion imply time. And if ultimate reality is not sort of confined by a space-time framework, then everything we're saying is just words in the end. Everything we're saying is a narrative. It's a sacred narrative, and as a sacred narrative, it motivates people to think and act in certain ways. As a minimal claim for the Baha'i faith, we could say it offers a new kind of sacred narrative through which humanity can find points of unity and finally act together as we need to save the planet, to save ourselves. But these narratives necessarily being expressed in words with terminology and concepts that imply things like space and time almost inevitably, and therefore with theological concepts like the afterlife and God and so forth, and the human soul, which we can't escape applying notions of motion, progress, this, that, I, thou. It's worked into, it's baked into the grammar of our language, that you have subjects and objects and verbs and things happening, and and one noun is separate from the other noun, and our whole lives we've been speaking languages that bake in through their very grammar certain ways of addressing the world, which Baha'u'llah says are incorrect, at best an approximation. Perhaps that's why Baha'u'llah in his Tabat Tabanashi Sahib says it's a remedy. Says this, I'm the physician, and what I'm offering the world is a remedy, which is like such a more pragmatic way of thinking about what Baha'u'llah is really doing. He diagnoses an illness, disunity, hatred, war, and he's prescribing the remedy. And the remedy is, here's a way of looking at the spiritual experience of the human race, which enables us to reconcile our differences. It doesn't force us into some artificial kind of unity. Instead, it recognizes and validates the differences. And that's part of the whole point of this series on mysticism, is that Baha'u'llah is talking about these different valleys, and the seekers in these different valleys can have vastly different ways of looking at the world. And Baha'u'llah recognizes this is like the human condition. It's like there is no point at which everyone is going to be in valley number 7 or whatever. It's like there's always going to be people in different holding different perspectives. And so perhaps the best we can do is offer a kind of guiding framework, a sacred framework that is compelling to the hearts and minds, and that gives us a way of moving forward together in unity. Maybe that's not a big enough claim. And that's where also, for some, they have to believe that this is absolute truth. Otherwise, they won't be motivated by it. They have to believe. There's an amazing tablet of Baha'u'llah, Tablet of the 7 Questions, Law Haft Korsesh. It was also translated within the last 10 or 20 years. Baha'u'llah says, reward. He says the afterlife is a reality because reward and punishment demand it. It's like he's totally reversed the causality. It's like, why is this a notion of the afterlife a reality? Because reward and punishment demand it. And Baha'u'llah says elsewhere that reward and punishment are the pillars upon which civilization is built. People have to be, most people at least, have to be motivated by the promise of reward and the threat of punishment. So that's what holds society together. It's a very pragmatic thing. I won't say cynical, but pragmatic. He recognizes the human condition. He realizes people need to be motivated. Whereas, what does the Bab say about this? He says, worship God in such wise that should thy worship lead thee to the fire, no change would be produced in thy worship. Such and such only befits the worship of the one true God. So likewise should thy recompense be paradise. So the Bab is inviting us into a station in which we're not like doing things because if there's some promise of paradise. We're not doing it because, oh, I want to get to the next valley. I want to reach whatever, this this higher state of mystical insight. That's why I'm on this path. The Bab says that shouldn't be why you're doing it. It says you do it solely for the love of God. Well, what does that mean? Is God outside me, inside me? Whatever that means to you, that should be the motive. It's out of the pure motive of love for existence, if you want to call it that, of love for truth, of love for humanity. But not because, oh, I've been promised this, I want a really cushy afterlife. I want to get to the valley of X, Y, or Z, it's like that. That's the wrong way to set it up. But, so that's what the Bab says. But Baha'u'llah says you need reward and punishment. So Baha'u'llah is like Baha'u'llah, in this sense, the Bab is like the mystic. He has like these amazing mystical passages. And Baha'u'llah is like, he's the pragmatist. He's like, okay, this is what we're faced with. This is what humanity needs. So here's the toolkit. Houses of justice, consultation, unity of mankind is going to be achieved through these very pragmatic means. I mean, Baha'u'llah also, that's its oversimplification, of course, but because Baha'u'llah also has a number of mystical passages, but it's almost as though Baha'u'llah got tired of, he almost, I don't know, maybe that's not the right way to put it. There's a tablet of Baha'u'llah and tablets of Abdu'l-Baha after the Akdas, where he says something like, and this is a paraphrase, he says, it was initially our hope, that humanity would come around and recognize, but now we realize that not only have they not come around, but they've actually regressed. So towards the end of Baha'u'llah's ministry, he kind of adds this it's very sad to hear, but it's as though he realizes, humanity just isn't ready to do things for the right reasons. It's not ready to live up to that statement of the Bab, worship God in such wise that should thy worship lead thee to the fire. Humanity needs, people are still children, and they're going to be children for at least the next dispensation. So here it is, your framework of reward and punishment. Here's a very robust concept of an afterlife, which is necessitated by reward and punishment, he says in the Tablet of the Seven Questions. But the reality is that such should not be the wellspring of human motivation. I don't know, maybe that's one of the things that Baha'u'llah said in that tablet. Don't say this to those who aren't ready to hear it. But, but I started this whole series, like it's session number 1 with, there are no secrets in the Baha'i faith, right? There are no secret doctrines. And that's still true. Everything I'm saying is on the surface. Everything I'm saying is I'm quoting from this tablet, that tablet, and so forth. There are no like hidden tablets that, that contain the real deal. But there's just so much of it that it's easy to lose the needle in the haystack. And it's a big haystack. I mean, it's 6 million words, and the Bab, another 5 million words. And sometimes these needles, these little bits of insight that like connect all huge swaths of the rest of it, you really have to look hard for them. Because Baha'u'llah doesn't say, here are the needles. Here are the bits that make everything else, that kind of throw everything else into focus. It's kind of up to you to find those. And in that sense, it's hidden. It's just hidden in plain sight. All right. Still 2 hands raised.
I can hold it if it's late. Can I ask
Okay.
it another time?
Okay, we can. Yeah, so 7:52. So we've been going for an hour and 10 minutes or so. Hour and 15. This was there's still one hand remaining. Manav? No. Okay, if not, we can. Oh, yes, you've unmuted. There's no audio coming through if there is an attempt to ask. If not, we can just reconvene next time, I guess, 2 weeks from now.
Yeah, we can't hear you, Manav, but maybe I guess also you could write it down, and Farhad maybe as well, and you guys will go first next time with questions. Yeah, that seems fair.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks everyone for listening up to this point. Look forward to next time.
Incredible. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Awesome.
Thank you.
All right.
Stephen.
Thank you.